Okay, I want to tell you a bit about hybridization and why certain species can produce hybrids, like polar bears and grizzly bears can produce what's called, they're either called growler bears or pisleys. Either way, they're the same species. Wolves and dogs can produce hybrid offspring. Horses and donkeys produce mules. There are tons of hybrid offspring, tons of examples in nature. It's definitely possible, but not all animals can produce offspring with each other. But what I wanted to talk about in particular was the idea of a species. So, in biology, the basic definition that most people are taught of a species is a group of living things that can reproduce with each other and produce fertile offspring. So when a horse and a donkey reproduce, they they give birth to a hybrid offspring, a mule, which is infertile. That was always like a classic example of hybridization and of like the definition of a species in nature. But that is just not true in all cases. Like Pisley bears or Growler bears, they're often fertile. The dog hybrids are often fertile. Coy wolves, um, wolf dogs, like those are often fertile. And so you can have like a second generation Pisley bear. So the definition of species starts to look a little suspect when you start looking closer. But when you're looking at, it isn't always to do with visually, like a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, for example, they're the same species. So, like, visually, you might not think animals are compatible. And sometimes there is like a physical limitation of like size difference. They may be physically incompatible with each other. But assuming that's not the case, um, the most common limitation is actually the number of chromosomes. So, different species have different number of chromosome pairs, and when we branch off from each other, as we differentiate, as like the tree of life splits off, the number of chromosomes within a species is something that can change. And so if that changes, then they typically stop being able to interbreed with things that they used to share the number of chromosomes with. So in general, it's close genetic relation that makes it possible to interbreed. Whether or not they that embryo is going to develop, if it's going to be successful, like for example, in snakes, even just line bred traits, sometimes you'll have ones where they'll have even behavioral problems, like it'll be hard to get them to eat in the beginning. And so there is a lot that goes into this. There are lots of behavioral barriers to hybridization as well. So snakes have something called brumation, which is where it's like hibernation. They do it in the winter when it gets cold generally, but a lot of snakes that do it, snakes that live places that are cold enough for them to need to brumate, they it basically stimulates their biological clock is tuned around this. So their follicle stimulation in the female, like basically egg production and stuff, to where they, if you want to mate them, if you just have a pet snake, like my hog noses, they need to be brumated in order to mate them. Most colubrids do. My ball python, she she lives in the rainforest. She's from a tropical area, and so they don't experience enough seasonal variation in temperature to have a fall and winter to brumate. And so ball pythons don't need brumation. They don't brumate in the wild. And behavioral differences like that make species that could have interbred and even overlap geographically it makes it to where they aren't able to reproduce because so like for example and then there's also just other like preference, for example, and like polar bears and grizzly bears, they might just typically not interbreed because they don't prefer the look of each other, like they prefer their own species. And so like preference, like partner selection and preference is actually a really important part of selection and what genes make it to the next generation. And when you look at like migrating species, you have to look at whose ranges overlap at what points of the year, because certain species will and migrating species often mating will happen in a certain location as part of that process so that the babies are born in the right spot in the right conditions. If that is the case, even if a species could produce a hybrid offspring with this species that's passing through, like if there's a species of bird that passes through that migrates, and it could produce a hybrid offspring with another species of bird that is just native here that sticks around all year. But because the migrating bird migrates in Canada or mates in Canada and like builds their nests in Canada each year and just comes down here in the winter. And so like if that's the case, then there will be no hybrid offspring here because the Arizona birds will never get the chance. They're not in Canada when this species is mating. And so you have to look at different, and then with birds too, you look at different courtship behaviors. Those can be very specific to the species. And that can actually contribute towards speciation, actually, when they get into incredibly complex mating displays. When that's actually something that I find very fascinating, is when courtship behavior leads to speciation or increased speciation. They're basically able to differentiate more because the mate preference is able to be more selective and particular. And then in social animals, you also have to look at who's allowed to mate. Um, and in less intelligent social species, and I'm thinking specifically of bees and ants, that is a reproductive, like the caste. So reproduction is done by caste. They have a whole sterile caste of workers. But why that's significant is because in a lot of a lot of ant species, they mate with their own species to produce the queens, and they mate with other species to produce infertile workers instead of just evolving fertile workers. They are actually genetic hybrids to be infertile workers. And I think that that's so interesting. Like part of their life, like this queen has to mate outside of the species in order to lay her workers. That is so fascinating. Okay, I want to tell you about the sex determination system that's common in the insect kingdom. Hymenoptera, they use this a lot. It basically is what makes them so tolerant to incest and inbreeding. But basically, what it is um, for a male, they only have one copy of each gene. Uh, so they're a, a haploid is a male. Then a female is called a diploid because she has two copies. And so unfertilized eggs that just get the one copy from the mother of each gene develop into males. Fertilized eggs that then get the second half from the father, from the sperm, contributing the second half of the DNA, the second copy, they have two copies. So they're called diploids. This makes it to where they're a little bit more tolerant to inbreeding. One basic example is because like males avoid the problem with troublesome recessives, and they only have one copy, but they all so like that's a pretty direct way. But they also it makes it to where. But basically, what's interesting is that then like a female queen can lay male eggs as a virgin. A lot of insects can do this. There can be virgin mothers, but the eggs that they lay, none of them will be females. None of them can lay eggs themselves. Their only role, they'll develop into males, and their only role is to then go off and spread like the mother's genetic information. And so it's almost like they produce males for genetic variation, but they're kind of sending them out there like playing the long game. They're playing for the next generation. And so like the next generation of queens will include, but I did want to explain a little bit about the Haplo-diploidy system. And it's common in Hymenoptera, which is the group that includes ants, bees, and wasps. Species aren't separated by a single wall. They're separated by thousands of small biological differences that accumulate over millions of years. The closer two species are on the tree of life, the more likely it is that they can produce hybrid offspring.
This is the girl who was born last year, and I've decided to call her Rosie. It's gonna be her name. Here's little Rosie. This is the boy who was born in 2025, and I decided to name him Alistair. Alistair's a really curious one. He always comes right up to me. He's my only snake that does that. He's almost friendly. This is little Alistair. He's very cute. He's so cute. I don't want to stress him out too much. I'm gonna put him back. I'm really happy with little Alistair. Snakes smell with their tongue. It's actually why they're forked. So, like, we have two nostrils so we can smell with direction. They have forked tongue so that they can smell with direction. That's why their tongue physically moves towards the thing that they're smelling and that they're interested in. God, he's so pretty. He's such a pretty boy. I think Alistair's a pretty good name for him. He's so cute. Casting shadows, sun was pushing through. I spoke a lot of words. I don't know if I spoke the truth. Got so much to lose. Got so much to prove. God, don't let me lose my mind. Trouble on my left, trouble on my right. I've been facing trouble almost all my life. My sweet love, won't you pull me through? Everywhere I look, I catch a glimpse of you. I said it was love, and I did it for love, and I did it for you. Whew. I've been going for an hour and a half. I've been biking a lot. I started with jogging, but I was really out of shape, and it wasn't just my cardio. My leg muscles had atrophied so much that it was placing a lot of strain that my skeletal system and my ligaments were having to pick up. Like they were having to pick up all the slack that because my muscles weren't doing enough to stabilize the joints. And so having my feet pound against the pavement, and I lost so much weight that the fat pad on the bottom of my feet, they have worn so thin that my nerves just get crushed against the ground. And so like the inside half of both my big toes, I just can't even feel them anymore. They actually are starting to come back now that I'm gaining weight, and I've been stopping. I've been trying to keep myself from pounding my feet into the pavement. This works a lot better. I'm able to just keep going. It's like 6:30 in the morning almost. I work at 7, so I'm gonna have to wrap up soon. I'm trying to get in a 2-hour bike ride before work. And when I'm out here on my bike, I'm just singing for the world to hear.